Hello and welcome to the Philosophy Vibe. Today I am with my good friend Helmut Pisecky, who is from Vienna, and we're going to have this episode in English, although his mother tongue is, of course, German. He speaks, of course, excellent English, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. We both know each other through the Joshua boot camp, the teachings of Joshua, and actually, when I joined, he was signed to me as a coach, and I've had good contact with him in the short time that we've known each other. And I feel like we're on a mutual trip here of using these teachings and figuring out how to um, bring it about in daily life. And so I'd like to start there. Maybe Helmut, if we could just talk first about maybe how you came to these teachings and a little bit about your background.
So first of all, thanks for having me. It's really nice to have this interview or this conversation rather in English this time, because otherwise we'd rather talking in German. So I've actually started out with Joshua a couple of years ago. I think it was one of the first ones who listened to this Joshua stuff and Gary's podcast right from the beginning. Certainly know that he started out on LOA Talk Radio, where he had his first episodes, and then I sort of got hooked to it rather. I have to say, however, that this sort of spiritual stuff has actually been with me all my life, since I can remember. Probably, or rather certainly, because my parents were quite open-minded when it came to all those things. So my parents taught me quite early all about yoga, about other spiritual things. So they were quite open-minded for basically everything from astrology, numerology to yoga and other kinds of spirituality. So it's actually been with me all of my life, part of my life. And then some 10 years or so ago, rather almost exactly 10 years ago, I founded my own company. And I think one of the issues for me was, as it is for all people basically, how to attract money using the law of attraction. I think this is where basically 90% of people who are working with LOA or who come in contact with LOA get started, more or less. And that was actually the start of a very intensive journey. I've not yet manifested the $1 million or €1 million on my bank account, but I'm still working on it. So, well, let's wait and see what the new year is going to bring.
I mean, it's interesting because you, obviously speaking German, how did you find, I mean, were you attracted to English-speaking sites, or did you find it that this information was only in the English-speaking realm and that in the German podcast, or I don't know, the other avenues, there was just not enough information for you?
It's a very interesting question, actually, because for quite some time I've been thinking about the differences between, let's say, the spiritual scene in the US and in Britain, basically in the US on the one hand, and in Germany on the other hand, which I'm following quite closely. Germany, of course, also including Switzerland and Austria, so the German-speaking countries, basically. Now I had the impression that, for instance, law of attraction as a household word is basically a household word in the United States, where it's used quite regularly. And if you say LOA or law of attraction, everybody basically knows what you're talking about, at least since The Secret has been published and the movie has been around. While if you look at the scene in Germany, for instance, I have the impression that they are, of course, also very interested in spiritual stuff, because I mean they have this philosophical tradition in Germany, just as they have in, let's say, France, Britain, etc., etc. But it seems to me that their spectrum is quite larger. So if you talk to a German who is interested in spiritual stuff, it's about the law of attraction, but it's also about universal laws in general. It's also about various methods like numerology, astrology, etc., etc. So it's not so much focused on attraction, basically attraction of money, as the Americans are, at least that's my impression. But the Germans are rather into trying to understand how the universe works, how the cosmos works, how everything comes together, and those kinds of things. On the other hand, I have the impression that one of the basic differences, for instance, between Germany and Austria is that, of course, I would say the spiritual scene in Germany is much larger, but also more vibrant. I have the impression that Austrians are more, I would say, close to nature. I mean, this is something that Germans usually associate with Austria. Yeah, it's all the beautiful scenery, the mountains, etc., etc. And I have the impression that in comparison to Germans, Austrians are more grounded, are more closer to nature, as I just said, and have a much stronger connection to nature and are not so much with the head in the clouds like the Germans, basically. With all the positive and negative aspects the one and the other thing have, of course.
I mean, you guys are very high up there, so in a sense, you are more in the clouds because of the mountains.
Physically, yes.
The Austrians I've met, it's definitely, there's a bit of a different vibe, a bit more, I don't know what to say. I would like to use a little bit cooler in some ways, just a bit more relaxed German style. This is a very big generalization. It's just my impression. As far as how one finds these teachings and the laws of the universe, and that you as you said, a lot of Americans, through trying to attain maybe material wealth, they get at first interest in the subject of attraction, law of attraction, and then either they stay there or go on. And where you're saying like Germans, maybe more their connection with nature, the philosophical background, which actually is something I studied, German philosophy. And I know it's a very deep tradition of very deep thought. And this is a very, it's just two ways of coming to the same conclusions often. And in a sense,
absolutely,
how well you can explain what the laws of the universe are is not as perhaps as important as how well you use them and integrate them in your life. You don't have to actually completely, we will never understand what's really going on. We can just see patterns, and I see enough patterns to throw my hands and say, all my teachings in philosophy about nature of reality, they just touching the iceberg. You know, it's there's something very, I would say the ones that, if I were going to, I don't know if you're familiar with philosophy, but you know, those like Hegel, if you're familiar with Hegel's
I've started to read a book by Hegel.
What a coincidence.
I made something like 45 pages, so did not understand a single thought that he sort of threw out there. So I gave up on Hegel quite fast, actually.
I think it's a bad example. Maybe I'll say just more transcendental philosophers like Schopenhauer, for instance. He was very much influenced by Indian thought. He integrated that quite nicely. But with the German taste of criticism, I guess criticism can be a positive thing. Like it has to be rational to some degree. And this is a very big requirement for a lot of German thinkers, is they have to be able to, and Kant is the pinnacle of that, in my opinion.
Absolutely. There's one of my favorite anecdotes, which, if I remember that correctly, is from an American general who was the supreme commander of NATO in Europe, and he was actually in charge of NATO, of NATO forces during the Kosovo campaign in 1999, General Wesley Clark. He writes in his memoirs about this operations and the war that was going on. And interestingly, his second in command at the time was a German general staff officer. And so they came up with all sorts of challenges that they had to overcome, and plans and decisions they had to make, etc., etc. Also, of course, connecting with the political sphere on the one hand, the military forces on the other hand. And one day they were sitting together working out some specific problem. And in the end, Wesley Clark came up with an idea and said, well, I think this is going to work practically. And I had the impression that his German second in command was not really at ease with the solution they had found, and said, what's wrong with that? And this German general said, well, you know, we're really convinced this works practically. The big question is for me, does it work theoretically as well?
Yeah, that's a very interesting leeway into, how do you say, the idea of, you want to live a happy life? Well, if you're Kant, for example, and as ethics, I studied a lot and that's probably no coincidence, but you know, you have to earn it. So if you just became happy without actually working for the happiness in a certain kind of moral sense as well, that you are a good person, you do good deeds, you follow moral codes, you didn't deserve that happiness. So it's not something you should be enjoying. And
Absolutely.
this is obviously ridiculous to me now, is that this is not a game of who's the nicest guy on the block. This is just a game of how much do you love yourself? How much are you willing to be authentic? How much fear do you have? And how much do you not care what others think? And it doesn't matter if it's a categorical imperative that, you know, if you're familiar with the categorical imperative, it's an interesting tool he used to show how something can contradict itself. A certain, you know, if there's some sort of contradiction, then you have to say that you shouldn't do that. By universalizing it, and that's why you shouldn't lie and you shouldn't commit murder. It's a bit like the teachings of Jesus with you know, do unto your neighbor as you would like him to do unto you, but he had it a bit more refined and whole system. And like all systems, it falls apart. It's a beautiful attempt, but you see the weaknesses, and he in his own life too, you see how he was, you know, he believed. It's funny how this is going towards Kant, and I didn't expect this conversation to go this direction, but he was very much enamored with the idea of a moral sense, of a natural intuitive ability that people had, but he had difficulty integrating that with this, you know, rational construct. And I don't know if you're too familiar with Kant and philosophy.
Well, my subject as an historian has always been the historical background, of course.
Right.
And I had the impression that every time there comes up somebody like Kant or whoever, I would say, capitalizes on moral issues, this happens against the backdrop of what has happened historically before that. And before that, if you look at Germany or rather Central Europe, you had the 30 Years' War. It's maybe the same with the Renaissance, for instance, and the very chaotic times in medieval Italy with Machiavelli and everything that came after that. So I had the impression that this Kantian imperative and of course the huge influence that he has had after the 18th century was actually, I would say, some sort of reaction to everything that has been going on before that, with you know, the political stuff or the political developments in Europe until Kant, actually, when everything that happened, and we're talking basically about the various struggles and fights and rivalries between the feuding states in Western Europe, basically. It was an era where ethics and morals had been so subdued and so buried under power politics, actually, that I think it was simply the pendulum swinging back.
Definitely. I mean, this is everything is connected, of course, through waves of thought, and obviously a lot of these thinkers were at the forefront of their time as well. But obviously, in retrospect, we see the error of their ways, but they were never completely wrong. I think there were throughout history, the idea of the secret. Plato talks about things that are, you know, the cave allegory. And you can tell that they had ideas about forms and how to express the formless and the energy of life. And so it's beautiful to look back at the historical points and see that, yeah, okay, we've always been talking about this. It's just now let's move into the next phase, which is it's the teachings of Joshua based upon, I wouldn't say based, but in the tradition of Seth, Abraham, and other channels, which are bringing, how do I say, thought to another level that isn't not necessarily what I would call, it's not normal human thought. It's from a perspective that humans have to kind of have faith in, because in the drudgery of life, you're distracted by a lot of illusions, and
absolutely.
But behind these illusions seem to be entities that have a perspective of not being drowned underneath the water. They can kind of see us from that, and they're helping us and guiding us, but they're not jumping in with us necessarily.
Absolutely.
And they're feeding us a little bit. But yeah, let's go a bit more into that. What your thoughts about? Like I said, on a personal level, these ideas, Joshua, and these kind of thinkers, what have they done for you?
It's an excellent question. Of course, one thing that they do automatically is to change your perspective. And still to this very day, I mean, I mentioned before that I've been sort of exposed to those perspectives throughout my life, and still um, I struggle with the fact that sometimes those perspectives seem so aloof to me. And I think if you're down the spiral, to put it in the words of David Strickle, it might seem almost cynical and sarcastic, because those entities say, well, don't take it easy, or take it easy, don't take it so seriously. And then you're stuck right in the middle of your personal drama, just having been divorced, or your child has just died, or whatever. And then they come up with something like, okay, take it easy, don't take it that seriously, that's just part of life, and what does it do for you, etc., etc. So I think when you're really down the spiral, when you're really feeling bad, and this might really seem almost sarcastic at some times. On the other hand, it really depends on the mood. And as Gary has pointed out repeatedly, of course, all of those people who are in this very small community right now are highly sensitive. And what I've noticed, particularly throughout the recent months, is that when you are highly sensitive and when you're up the spiral most of the time, when you're down the spiral, it's very, very intense. It's really very intense. And for me, what was very helpful was simply to know how the system works, and that being down the spiral is simply part of the process. And
we should mention that Gary Temple Bodley is the channel of Joshua, and he's the one that runs the boot camp, and once again is responsible for, I think, bringing us together. And yeah,
exactly.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but yeah, that's absolutely true. That one of the biggest things that I've learned is through these teachings, of course, is to embrace the downs just as well as the ups, because they give our life that, how do you say, the desire. You have to have a mechanism for going on, doing more of who you are, not staying where you think you should be safe. That's why when you have a big, quick, and explosive negative emotion, for me, well, it doesn't happen too often, but I can recognize it very quickly, identify it, and then attempt to step away from that feeling and into my natural state, which is more middle, carefree, and like you think you're most of the time relaxed. You're not cared about much about politics as much as you probably used to be. It's one of the big things that's changed with me as well. I don't worry about my health as much, or I actually never really did. But it's like these things that are, for people, part of their thoughts. They don't. We're lucky because we realize and that it's a choice, that you, wherever your direction of your thoughts go, and you can control if you wanted to go more towards the negative or the positive. And by going towards negative, you're not fixing the negative. That's the big paradox. The paradox is people believe that if they focus on the negative, that it burns it away. No, it makes the fire greater. And that's why it's better to look in the other direction, towards the positive, what's good in the situation, what's good in life, appreciate things. And this is part of the daily practices in the Joshuan boot camp, which has really helped me out a lot too.
Yeah. Me too. One of the real, I would say, tangible advantages for me, and when I was sort of learning this stuff, was simply to be more and more aware that I am not my feelings, and being down the spiral, feeling really like having a meltdown. It's a wave. It comes and goes, basically. And if it comes, okay, just let it pass through. And you know that tomorrow or next week or so, you will feel better once again, because it's simply part of the process. It simply happens. It's part of the game. So accept it. And I don't know what was your experience. I've had meltdowns regularly. I still have them. And I have to say, looking back, every time I had such a meltdown, when I was thinking like giving it all up and throwing all this rubbish out, every time I had a meltdown, it was looking back now, always a big step forward, because it was always connected with shedding part of my persona and dropping the mask that I'd been wearing, dropping some sort of limiting belief, deeply held limiting belief. So it was also always a very, very, a very large step towards being more authentic. So
Yes.
every meltdown in the end was really very much to my advantage.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, you can embrace that because it propels you quite a bit further if you have these big manifestation events, which Joshua talks about, things that really pull your emotion in a positive or negative way. But if it's a negative, then that has a lot of reward behind it, a lot of potential for growth. And, and so I don't have, like, once I became aware, I would say I never doubted the awareness. Once I saw the truth, I didn't question it. And that was very strange for me because I come from a philosophical background where you're supposed to look at things from different perspectives, but it resonated with my heart and my soul in a way that I never had before. The ideas of Bashar, Abraham, not just channels, but, Michael Beckworth, I think. There's a lot of, they're not gurus, just teachers who are not, too afraid to stand up and be authentic, and
yeah,
Eckhart Tolle is
and
also a good
expose
example.
themselves and be visible. Absolutely.
Yeah. It does, because it's not, how do you say, my previous perspective would have been, you this is bullshit. These guys are being too wishy-washy, too much feminine feeling, just love and everything be good, and
The
a lot
tree
of,
huggers. Yeah.
yeah, and now I embrace it in myself and see, oh wow, they are speaking the truth, and it's becoming more and more obvious that even the biggest cynics, I'm positive in a few more years it'll be normal that this be talked about on the streets. People will understand that, at least on some level, that they control the world through their feelings and thoughts, but not as much to their doing, even though that's hard for people to accept. And I'm sure this is the direction we're going in. I know what
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned politics, by the way, and one of the things I found interesting, and Jessica has actually pointed it out to me when she was my coach when I made the first boot camp,
Nice.
that I asked a couple of questions during the Joshua Live calls, and most of those questions, interestingly, revolved around how to, which role I, as an individual, would play in society, on the collective level, so to say. And that's also part of my background, basically, because I served as a military officer for more than 12 years. And as such, you are always, of course, connected to the collective, society, the national interest, if you can call it that way. In other words, you do it not just for your own purposes, for individual purposes, but simply for a collective entity, whatever that might be.
May I ask how you're saying that you came from a very spiritual background for your family. What drew you to the military then? I mean, were your parents supportive of you in that?
It's part of my family tradition to some extent, and I've always been very interested into this subject, basically. So I've always felt some connection to some sort of military environment. It was a very interesting experience, by the way, because as a highly sensitive person, the military is probably not the place to go. I mean, as a highly sensitive person, there are 3 places not to go. One is an oil rig, the second is a coal mine, the third is the military.
Or prison.
Absolutely. So what you do automatically is, of course, to look for some sort of niche where you say, okay, this is part of the system, but it's a niche where I can actually live quite well and capitalize on my strengths and not be exposed to my weaknesses. So that's what I did, basically.
What was your highest rank? What did you achieve?
Captain.
Wow, nice. It was the Army?
It was the Army, yeah.
Okay, because I know now you have your own security business. So does that tie in somehow? Did you learn through your military education?
To some extent, because one of the things that I teach as a trainer is crisis management and crisis communication. And there's a lot of similarities between, I would say, military procedures, staff operations on the one hand, and the civilian crisis communication, crisis management procedures on the other hand. So there are similarities and things that you can use from the one sphere in the other as well. But basically, I think it's more the management skills and the leadership skills that you learn in the military that are really extremely useful, also in the civilian sphere.
Because you're put under pressure in a way that normal people wouldn't be put under pressure, and you know that you come out okay at the other side. Isn't it? That's probably a very nice.
That's one thing, and I think that the second basic advantage is that you're put in leadership positions at quite a young age. I mean, I served as a platoon commander, a platoon leader, with some 30 people in my platoon and infantry platoon when I was 25 years old.
Oh.
And this is something that you simply usually do not do in the civilian sphere. When you're working in a private enterprise, then you're a specialist, an expert, or you're entry-level jobs or something like that. And once you're head of a department or a subdivision or something like that, you're beyond 30. So I think this is one of the basic advantages of the military, that at a quite young age, you get to get a lot of practical experience in leadership. And
this is a
specific.
Sorry, I'm sorry to jump in, because it's a very unique perspective you have, because we're talking about spiritualism, and is it possible to be a spiritual person in the military? And did that add to your spiritual life, or did the contrast more speak to you? But I'm sure when you're with your platoon, your family, they became probably much like your family. You were able to maybe sense certain things that I don't know that others maybe wouldn't have sensed.
That's a very broad subject and a very interesting one. Interestingly, in the military, you would meet more people who are interested in spiritual things than you would imagine from the outside. Of course, some of the, I would say, officers, NCOs for serving in, let's say, a fighting company or something like that, are rather, well, coarse in their approach to life, and maybe not so spiritual in their outlook and in their approach. But in certain specific niches, there are very, very interesting, very colorful people that you meet. So it's quite surprising sometimes. And I had the impression that in comparison to other officers and NCOs, my approach to leadership was definitely different. Absolutely, yeah. With more empathy and yeah, generally different. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Austrian military is not in too many international theaters. You're probably stationed mostly at home in Vienna, right? Or is that where you
basically, yes. So I had 2 deployments to Kosovo.
Oh, Kosovo. Of course, that was a hot. How was that? Did you see a lot of violence?
It was actually a post-conflict scenario. So basically the war took place in 1999, and then KFOR, led by NATO, basically was deployed there a couple of months after that, and that's where the one Austrian task force also deployed with them, still there. So it was actually a post-conflict environment. Right in the beginning, I was there with the 5th contingent. It was in 2001, and the situation was really tense at that time. And then it was actually more about stabilizing the situation, also being prepared for civil unrest, which happened a couple of times later. And I was there a second time in 2004, 2005 in the intelligence branch. And it was interesting because at that time, the Prime Minister of Kosovo, Ramush Haradinaj, actually turned himself into the International Court in The Hague. And we were prepared for that scenario, preparing for that scenario, expecting some sort of civil unrest, demonstrations, etc., etc. And it was also throughout our, I would say, active participation in managing the process and also preparing for the scenario that we managed to calm the situation down, which worked quite well in the end. So it was, I would say, tense, but it was definitely not a fighting environment, something that you would have in, let's say, Afghanistan, Iraq, or something like that.
But you were still under pressure, and you were able to perform under this pressure. And there's the idea of a spiritual warrior, I think, is kind of a nice concept, because, to fiercely hold on to your beliefs and your truth, no matter what, is a very much kind of a soldierly perspective. And I have that sometimes where I don't care if the whole world would it be against me. I guess in some level I would, but these teachings have helped me to just realize that there's so much more going on, and I don't have to worry about perspectives that are just at a negative, lower level. They allow to exist, and people can think of me what they will. I have you know, enough in myself and my family and friends and who I am, that's okay. So yeah, that's it is a, you know, we want a world of peace, and I think that part of that, but peace doesn't mean just, you know, running away and here. It means standing up when you're called, and you call yourself, you know, I guess.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the big issues, as I said before, in connection with these Joshua teachings, that uh, at the very basic level, it's extremely individualistic. It's you're the center of your universe. Other people, other things, everything that happens is basically revolving like satellites around you. So it's you and you creating your environment. And the one thing that has been bothering me for quite some time during the boot camp was, okay, now this is me as an individual person. Do I create everything that happens to me? What about co-creation? What about the environment I'm living in? If I happen to live in, let's say, Afghanistan, is this also my creation, being caught in a situation where there's basically a civil war going on? Have I created that? Is this part of my pre-birth intentions? How do all those things together? If I'm serving in the military, they deploy me to some conflict in some foreign country, and I don't know, I get hurt or maimed or whatever. Is this part of my pre-birth intentions? How do I deal with that? And how is this connected to me as an individual? And it's still sometimes hard for me to understand. And one thing that I think has become clearer to me is that actually from the spiritual perspective, that diversity, some would call it chaos, or diversity, it's just a matter of perspective, has the advantage that, for instance, you have now as an individual, wherever you're living, the chance, the possibility to manifest many more experiences than you had 100 years ago. For instance, if you want to be, I don't know, robbed, beaten down, beaten up, or caught in a violent demonstration in civil unrest, you can do that without leaving a European country.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, we had to travel to some, I don't know, African country or somewhere to Central Asia to become a victim in a terrorist attack. Now you can have that right at the doorstep. I mean, that's what it has turned out in recent years.
Yeah,
So
there's
this sort of diversity chaos offers a much larger range of opportunities if you put it in this perspective.
definitely. I mean, we have to, of course, throw away the idea of victimhood altogether.
Absolutely.
That's one of the first things that these teachings and all channels, they come to this perspective is that you're the creator, and if you believe you're a victim, you're creating a life of victimhood, but you're still creating it. So you're going to put yourself in situations and that you ask, this cannot be where I would like to be, but it's just a reflection. The way out is actually a process that is shown to you if you're open to it, and you allow, it comes to everyone. We have all equal access to our higher self, source, whatever you want to call it. It's definitely there. Doesn't matter if you're in Afghanistan or if you're in Beverly Hills. And especially there are people in all these situations who are living magnificent, joyful lives in the poorest of countries, and people, of course, living what they would say are horrible lives and complete wealth.
Absolutely.
And this is something that there's no coincidence in that we know this, and it's become just the idea that, as you said, did I intend this before my birth? And we set intentions, as Joshua says, but we're given the reins during our life to have free will. And the two of us and many others have realized, you know, we have to step up and accept our own, everything. This is all, you know, it's all responding. It's co-creation, but like I'm creating with you this moment, but you know, obviously your perspective is different than my perspective. At the same time, I intend a wonderful conversation that will, you know, be joyful, and I hope the same for you. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Absolutely,
It
absolutely.
sounds hard. It sounds hard, but that's what I've learned from this, right? You too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that it's really hard to grasp for other people who don't have this sort of understanding of these spiritual concepts. That it sounds very cynical, and it sounds as if you would say, okay, um, if you have been raped, you have created this situation. Of course, that's what it sounds like to outsiders who don't know the concept. And I think this is also the place where a lot of misunderstandings happen.
This is a game that's how do you say it? It's for masters. Like so
Mm,
everyone here supposedly is ready for any situation that comes to them.
mhm,
They may
mhm,
not believe they're ready, but if they have a non-physical staff, they have guidance.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
It's
mhm,
just trusting that guidance beyond the person or the family who may say otherwise. That's
mhm,
that's where
mhm,
you're like, oh, but that's my mom. I have to give her more weight
mhm,
than
mhm, mhm.
my own feelings, even because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
she gave
Mhm,
birth
mhm.
to me. I owe her so much. This is just a my mom just saying for general people they take that as to be the an anchor point for them, and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, absolutely,
It's yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Also have to say that one of the things that has really kept me going is that even in those moments when I had doubts about the spiritual things and wanted to throw it all out, um, I did not really have a viable alternative, frankly speaking, because obviously the alternative would have been to revert to the old control system, control approach. And I know very deeply inside of me that this is not for me and this is not working. So what else can you do than simply keep going? I mean, if there is no
That's what.
alternative, yeah,
Yeah, but the
carry on.
fact that the two of us are talking about this and putting it out there, it doesn't matter how many people watch it, but we're showing other people there are ways we help each other just by
Mhm,
saying I'm also incorporating this, and I agree 100%. You can't go back to control,
mhm, mhm,
no matter what that looks like.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
Doesn't
mhm,
You can try, but you won't have by necessity. You won't
mhm, mhm, mhm.
create what you desire. It just can't be.
Absolutely. And you will find out that you will have a burnout very soon when you even try to sort of go back to this control approach. It simply doesn't work. I mean, I've had the feeling that every fiber of my body says, no, no, don't do it. It's not going to work out. It was simply like you get let go of all the energy and have the next meltdown. So it simply doesn't work. It's not really an alternative. Absolutely.
This is maybe a good point to maybe bring up something that you do your own podcast as well. You started
Mhm, mhm.
just before I started mine, and maybe you can tell people what your inspiration was and how they can find you.
Yeah, the podcast is called Flow, das Gesetz der Anziehung, which means the law of attraction actually in German. We have a YouTube channel. We have now the podcast on Anchor FM, and I'm still working on the distribution to other platforms as well. So let's see how this is going to work out. Basically, the inspiration was to make this Joshua stuff available to people like, well, my mother, for instance, who speaks some English, but simply not good enough because in her generation, it was not as usual as it is nowadays to learn English in grammar school and things like that. So I think there's a lot of people out there who might be interested in this sort of stuff who don't speak English that well. So what we thought basically was simply to take this, this content, take these issues, and put them out there in a way, in a language that is easily digestible to a larger audience. That was basically the idea, and also, of course, to have the exchange with other students who have been part of this Joshua Bootcamp, who have their own background, their own experiences, their own approach, their own perspective, and simply to use this also as a means of self-reflection, of course, because this boot camp is, even though you have your coach, of course, and you're in constant contact with your coach, it's simply a process where you do a lot of the work yourself. I mean, you fill out the forms and you do this meditations, etc., etc. So it's something that you do to 90, 80% or so on your own. And I think it's also very important, besides Joshua Live calls and the coaching calls, simply to have somebody else where you have this exchange and reflection, talk about various issues. And it's also interesting, also very interesting every time talking to you, talking to Jessica, simply to bring up a couple of issues where I think, well, I've thought about this issue, I've asked Joshua during the live calls, and still I'm not yet clear about that. And what do you think about that? What's your perspective? What's your opinion on that? So I think it's also very good to have this sort of exchange and joint reflection on the teachings as well.
That's awesome. It's obviously in German, and so for the German-speaking audience, more relevant. The Joshua Roundtable, it's something where they also speak about Gary and others, their experiences, and that's also a magnificent platform. And I'll definitely put the link to your podcast, which I've been on and enjoyed, below. And I'll put down below also the link to the Joshua Bootcamp, Joshua Teachings, and hopefully, a few people maybe just take a look at it and floats their boat. Great. If not, it's also great.
Absolutely.
So good.
Absolutely.
And I guess our time is running a bit short, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's went in a direction I didn't expect.
Me too. Absolutely.
That's
absolutely.
like it's
very interesting.
It's always wonderful. I feel like we're always guided from non-physical. So if I come with a plan, I'm doing it, I can throw it away because there's too much inspiration in the moment when, you're talking to someone, we're very on the same vibration in many ways. And that's, and I wish you the best of luck in your...
Same to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Absolutely.
You're very welcome. And I, of course, would like to have you sometime soon and back on the podcast. We'll check up on things. Cool, Helmut.
Perfect.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye. Same to you. Same to you. Thanks. And have a wonderful new year, 2020.
You too. 2020 is going to be a big one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you.